I think a few weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago even, I mentioned a book that I had read recently called The Wayfinders: Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in a Modern World by Davis Wade. Wade began his career I think in the 1960s as an ethnobotanist, where he first traveled to the Amazon River basin and studying plants and medicines there, but then became interested in the people he encountered and eventually shifted his career path to becoming an anthropologist and has spent the rest of his life as an anthropologist studying ancient cultures. And in the book, one of the chapters, called People of the Anaconda, talks about the civilizations past and present that live along the Amazon River and its tributaries. The Amazon River encompasses the largest rainforest in the world. The river basin includes 1,100 rivers that drain into the Amazon. And a couple of those rivers are larger, far larger than the Mississippi, that drain into the Amazon. The basin itself is the size of the continental United States. And like all of the Americas, it was discovered by Europeans in a wave of exploration in the 14 and 1500s. In 1541, Gonzalo Pizarro, who was the half-brother of Francisco Pizarro, who was the conqueror of the Incas, took a group of 220 soldiers, 4,000 native porters, 2,000 pigs, on an expedition leaving Quito, which was then a Spanish or Portuguese outpost, across the Andes and down in towards the Amazon River basin. And they were looking for gold, and they were also looking for cinnamon. There was a belief that there were cinnamon trees, enormous cinnamon trees in the Amazon River basin, which turned out to be not true. But by the time they reached the lowlands, the tropical lowlands, all of their food was gone. They had consumed all of the horses they brought along the way. Most of their Indian slaves had died, and 140 of the Spaniards had also died. And the surviving men were reduced to stewing leather and eating that, and then scavenging for wild herbs and roots and berries, and many of them were poisonous. And so they were sick and they were deranged and they were dying. And in desperation, Gonzalo dispatched his second in command, along with 49 men, to go further down to look for help and to look for food. And among this group was a Dominican friar, Carvajal, who was the only person along who could write and read, and he kept a journal. And he wrote an astonishing account of the subsequent journey. They eventually made their way down to the Napo River, which is one of the 1,100 rivers that drain into the Amazon. And along the way, it should be pointed out that they decided to ditch the people they left behind and just to make their own way because they were not doing very well. But as they were traveling down the river, eventually to reach the Amazon itself, they found what they believed and described as one horror after another. Because what they found as they traveled along the river were thousands and thousands, and it turned out to be millions and millions of people who were there. Village after village along the river, with roads from some of the villages as they got further down the Amazon leading back to huge cities with incredible architecture. And they were horrified. And there were literally millions of people living along the Amazon. And they were, according to the descriptions of the friar, they were well fed, they were well provisioned, they dressed well. All along the way as they traveled, they were greeted by messenger drums, and then people by the hundreds and then thousands would come out along the river and watch them go, and some of them happened to have poisonous darts which they shot out and killed one after the other of the Spaniards as they traveled along. Of course, they had to stop every once in a while and get provisions. They also encountered some tribes that were led by women warriors, who the friar describes as big and strong enough to tackle and handle 10 men, one woman warrior to 10 men. Amazon. That's where the word comes from. The myth of the Amazon warriors, women warriors. It took them 8 months to reach the sea, and there were very few of them left. The friar eventually made his way back around the coast, back to Peru, where he published his journal, and it was met with derision. There could not be such civilization there. It was not possible. There could not be the architecture he described. And there could not be women warriors who were that powerful and that strong. But as subsequent exploration found out, it was all true. And unfortunately for the native population, there would be many more European encounters over the years. And of course there would be battles, but it wasn't the battles that killed them. It was the disease. It's just as it happened here in the northern part of the country, of the Americas. It was the encounter with Western diseases for which they had no way of fighting off that they died off. And it's estimated that up to 80% of the native population in South America was killed by their encounter with those diseases over just a few generations. So the natives who were left retreated up the tributaries and rebuilt a very different kind of life. A harder life, and yet one in which they continued to thrive. Wade tells of 2 other noteworthy encounters with the natives before he talks about his own work there. In 1743, the French explorer and geographer Charles Condamine led the first scientific expedition to travel the length of the river. And his ethnobotanical discoveries were unbelievable. He was the first person to identify quinine as a treatment for malaria, to discover, a Westerner, to discover rubber and to talk about how it was being used by the natives, to report the existence of barbasco, the fish poisons that would yield the biodegradable insecticide rotenone, and many more. He learned about all of these remarkable plants from the Native Americans. And yet this is what he would write about them. Before making them Christians, they must first be made human. Because the European attitude towards Native Americans, the predominant attitude was that they were arrested children, that they were immature and that their development was arrested as children. And by the way, the Native Americans also viewed the children as not being fully human. You aren't fully human until you grow up to be an adult. And so the Native Americans were children. And then Wade notes that despite European settlement and development all along the rainforest and the river basin over the years and then the centuries, there would still be countless tribes that had no Western contact right up until the 60s and the 70s. There were still tribes being discovered that had never met a Westerner before. In 1957, 5 missionaries attempted to contact one of those tribes, the Waorani, and made a critical mistake. They flew over, and they dropped from the air 8 by 10 glossy black and white photographs of themselves in what they thought was a friendly gesture, forgetting that the people of the forest had never seen anything two-dimensional in their lives. And so the Waorani picked up the photographs from the floor and picked it up, and they looked at the photographs, and then they looked behind the photographs. And they looked behind the photographs, and there was nothing there. And so their assumption was that this was some kind of devil or Satan figure or something like that. And so when the 5 missionaries came in to the area, they were promptly speared to death. And there are many more stories like that. It's just a fascinating account. But Wade has a point as he tells this story, and then he begins to tell of his own work there. He talks about the rainforest. The Amazon rainforest is just incredibly important to the health of the whole planet. It alone produces 20% of the fresh water on the planet. It stores the equivalent amount of carbon as a decade of global fossil fuel emissions in its trees. It plays a crucial role in the precipitation cycle of South America, and it pumps an inordinate amount of oxygen into the atmosphere that we all then breathe, earning it the nickname, the lungs of the world. And 1/3 of the known species of the world, plant and animal, live in the Amazon rainforest. It's incredibly lush and alive, but it's also incredibly fragile, because much of the land is covered by shallow soil. Here, in the old-growth forests, and also in prairie, you have topsoil that's many feet deep, because as the plant life slowly decays in our temperate climates, it builds up over the centuries. But in the rainforest, because it's so hot and so humid, when plant life falls to the ground, it breaks down very quickly, and so it doesn't build up over time. And so in large parts of the Amazon forest, topsoil is no more than 10 centimeters, which is like 4 inches, which is not very much. And so cutting trees and vegetation in the forest exposes the soil to baking and then erosion from rains, and sets off a ripple effect that cascades rapidly through the forest. And the destruction of the rainforest is proceeding at an incredibly sorrowful pace. It's driven by the demands of Western-style development. It's often aided by the natives who are trying to make a living there. Wade began his work in the Amazon in the 60s and has watched it happen. He was actually one of the first to write for the West about what was happening